Part 35. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 342. From being the wedding messenger in early February to now, except for most of the time at home, Tang Ning has gone to the natural center every day to sit, and will go to the palace every 2 days. However, since the Ministry of Rites confirmed the final etiquette a few days ago, after the protocol, he had no reason to enter the palace to see Zhao Man again. Although as a wedding messenger, it was easier for him to see Zhao Man than others, but since he went to Changning Palace every day for nothing, there was no guarantee that others would not suspect that he had other thoughts and intentions for the princess. The date of departure has been decided, and on the 3rd day of March, it is said that Kintian's supervisor has calculated the auspiciousness. Now it is almost late February, and there is only less than half a month left before departure. He hadn't seen Zhao Man for several days, and the next time he saw him would be the day of departure. In order to comfort her that the temporary separation was for a better reunion in the future, he wasted no time in talking. Shuxiu Palace. Concubine Shu put down the book in her hand and asked, Du Wan, if I remember correctly, today is already 18, right? A palace maid serving beside her immediately said, Back to your majesty, yesterday I was 18, and today I am 19. So soon concubine Shu stood up and said, There is less than half a month left until the 3rd day of March. Du Wan nodded and said, In 14 days, the princess will get married. Speaking of which, I haven't seen Manor for several days. I don't know how she is doing now. She put on a coat and said, Go to Changning Palace. Walking out of Shuxiu Palace, the palace maid named Du Wan said, I heard about these princesses. Shang Yi in the palace is teaching the princess etiquette. Concubine Shu shook her head and said, Her mother-in-law left early and was always pampered by His Majesty. It must not be easy for her to learn palace etiquette now. Du Wan followed concubine Shu and said, Last time I met the princess in the palace, I was much more haggard than usual. Being born in the royal family, she has to bear these things. Concubine Shu sighed and said, That's why I want to go over and comfort her, in case the child can't think about it. The two of them were talking and walked to Changning Palace. After passing through the door and coming to the yard with the garden in front, I suddenly heard a burst of singing. Guan Guan Juju, in the river island. A graceful lady, a gentleman likes to fight. The song was obviously coming from the mouth of a young girl. It was pleasant to the ears, and there was irrepressible joy in the voice, as well as an indescribable emotion. Concubine Shu took 2 steps forward before the girl's voice suddenly stopped, and she said in surprise, Why is your queen here? Concubine Shu was stunned, looking at the girl who was filled with joy. She had prepared a lot of words of comfort, but they were all useless at this moment. Not only was the girl not as haggard as she had imagined, but she was in high spirits. She had been dissatisfied with the marriage before, but now she sang Guanju in praise of men and women. The appearance inside Changning Palace was completely different from what she had imagined. Zhao Man came over and held her hand affectionately. Concubine Shu came to her senses and asked, How are you doing with manners etiquette? I've learned everything. Zhao Man looked a little proud and said, Su Shang'ai also praised me for learning quickly. That's good. Fang Shifei nodded and said, We are leaving in half a month. Are you ready? There's still half a month left. Zhao Man counted the numbers on his fingers and said, I've been ready for a long time. I really hope this half-month will pass quickly. Half an hour later, concubine Fang Shu walked out of Changning Palace with a confused look on her face. After standing there for a while, she shook her head and murmured, Today's young people are really becoming more and more incomprehensible. After leaving Changning Palace, she personally cooked a bowl of soup and sent it to the imperial study. When she returned to the palace and passed by the Hanlin Academy, she happened to meet Fang Zhe, who was coming out of the courtyard. Fang Zhe stopped, looked at her, and said, Second sister. Concubine Fang Shu nodded, looked at him and asked, How is that girl Xinyu doing lately? She hasn't been to Shuxiu Palace for a long time. Fang Jie said, she is good, but she is a bit playful. She's still young, so it's okay to be playful. When she grows up to the age of manner, she will naturally become sensible. Thinking of what just happened, she shook her head slightly and said, being sensible doesn't necessarily mean she will be more playful than others. When I was little, I would cry and laugh sometimes, but I am so old that I can't see what young people like them are thinking. Fang Jie looked forward and said slowly, young people should do what young people should do while they are young. Even if they make some mistakes because of impulsiveness, it is better than regretting it later. Throughout February, the news that attracted the most attention from the people of the capital was naturally the news of Princess Pinjiang's marriage. It is not unusual for the royal family to marry a princess. In recent years, one has been married almost every few years. However, the previous princesses were all married to the sons of nobles in the capital or the sons of important ministers. This time Princess Pingyang married the Chu state. No matter in terms of scale or influence, it cannot be compared with the previous princesses. The Chu state and the Chen state have been friendly neighbors to each other for decades and have a common enemy. Over the years, their relationship has gradually become estranged. This marriage is a direct manifestation of the reunification of the diplomatic relations between Chen and Chu. It is welcomed by the people of the Chen state. Of course, such a big thing as a marriage is related to the interests between countries and benefits the people of both countries. No one cares about whether the princess is willing to marry or what kind of life she will live after marrying. There must be someone who cares about things that others don't care about or don't care about. In addition to accompanying his family, Tang Ning has also been busy these days. He has prepared a lot of medicines by himself. After all, his martial arts skills are not very good at the moment, so he can only rely on surprise attacks. Driven by the determination to die, Tang Ning tried the medicine on Tang Yao Yao. Within a quarter of an hour, she fell asleep unconsciously, and after waking up, she did not realize that it was him who did it. He had to find an opportunity to remind the martial arts lady Tang. Although she is a martial arts expert, her awareness of prevention is too poor. Fortunately, he was the one who drugged her this time. If it was someone else, the consequences would be disastrous. With Lao Zheng around, the things he prepared were just in case, and they might not be used. More than half a month has passed, and Nanan's illness has almost healed. She can run and jump, and follow Fang Xinyu all day long. Lao Zheng can leave with peace of mind. At this point, Tang Ning has prepared everything he should prepare. Everything is ready, just waiting to set off. Su Ryu was busy in the room for a while, and said, Brother Xiaoning, remember to take this bag with you. Tang Ning looked at the huge bag and asked, what is this? Su Ryu said, we don't know how long we will be gone this time. I have prepared a few clothes for you in all 4 seasons, just in case. Tang Ning had just put the bag into the box, and Zhongyi handed him another small bag, saying, take these with you, you will need them on the road. Tang Ning opened the bag and took a look. There was a thick stack of silver bills inside. You don't need these silver bills are universal in Chen state, but it is a bit troublesome to exchange them in Chu state. Besides, this time they are going abroad at public expense, and all expenses are reimbursed by the state, so they don't need to pay for it themselves. Zhongyi rewrapped the bag and said, you should take it with you, just in case you need it. Even if you need to take some silver, you don't need to take so many silver bills. Although the face value is not very large, it adds up to more than 100,000 taels. Half a year is not too long or too short, but it is the longest time to be apart from them. Even though he started preparing a long time ago, he still felt that the time was not enough. After a long time, Tang Ning came out of the room, stood in the yard, and sighed leisurely. The Prince of Chu, who was full and had nothing to do, was really troublesome. Why did he ask for marriage? He walked out of the house and saw the rich man Tang coming out from next door. Tang Ning bowed, "Hello, Uncle Tang." Tang Yao Yao's father never liked him very much, but this time he actually gave him a smile before getting on the carriage and leaving. Tang Ning was a little surprised, and then he thought, if the rich man Tang left, wouldn't he be able to go through the main gate to find Tang Yejing? He was already familiar with climbing over the wall to enter Tang Yejing's yard, but he rarely went through the main gate. He stepped into Tang Yao Yao's yard and saw her sitting at the stone table in the yard in a daze. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 343. Spring has arrived, and Tang Yao Yao has been in a daze more and more often, especially after going to the temple to ask for a fortune last time. She became dull and dull. Looking at Tang Yao Yao sitting there with her chin in one hand, Tang Ning walked over and asked, "What's wrong? Your father forced you to get married again." Tang Yao Yao didn't answer, looked at him and asked, "Do you believe in fate?" "I don't believe it." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "You have to strive for your own destiny. Don't always rely on these illusory things. Just do what you want to do and get what you want. Go after the person you like, and you won't regret it even if you fail." Tang Yao Yao repeated his words, "Just do what you want to do, get what you want, and chase the person you like." Tang Ning sat side by side with her and said, "Tell me what troubles you have, and we can find a solution together." Tang Yao Yao thought for a while and said, "I have a very good friend, but he did something sorry for me. What should I do?" Tang Ning curled her lips and said, "What's the point of worrying about this? If anyone dares to do anything sorry to you, you'll beat him until his mother doesn't even recognize him. Let's see if he dares next time. In that case, I won't be polite." Tang Yao Yao nodded, looked at him, and said, "Tell me, what should I do about the last time you drugged me?" Tang Ning was startled and asked, "You, how do you know?" As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he realized that he was asking for it, but since Tang Yao Yao asked this, it was useless for him to quibble. Tang Yao Yao said, "I watched you do it." Tang Ning was shocked and said, "Then you still drink? I want to see what you want to do." Tang Yao Yao looked at him and said, "It's a pity that you didn't do anything." Tang Ning asked in confusion, "What a pity?" Tang Yao Yao corrected, "But..." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "What I just heard was a pity." Tang Yao Yao became angry and said, "I said yes, then yes. Just think of it as a no." Tang Ning didn't dare and didn't bother to argue with her, because when she couldn't argue with her, she would take another measure. He looked at Tang Yao Yao and said, "I'm just trying, no thinking of how easy it was for you to fall into this trap. I was just about to remind you that a girl's family should be more aware of precautions. Don't drink the water handed over by outsiders, and don't eat the food handed over by outsiders. You are not an outsider." Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and said, "I trust you." It felt good to be trusted by others, but even if she was knocked unconscious and no one knew what was going on, Tang Ning didn't do anything to her to deserve her trust. "Okay, let's not talk about this anymore." Tang Ning stopped continuing the topic and looked at her and said, "After I leave, I will ask you to take care of Xiru and Xiaoi. Although their skills in chess, calligraphy, and painting were average, they learned a lot of strange tricks from the old beggar." Together with Tang Yao Yao, they didn't have to worry about Xiru and Xiaoi's safety. "Take care of yourself, too." Tang Yao Yao looked at him and said, "Don't think that you can flirt with others while you are far away in Chu State. If Xiaoi finds out, I'll see what you say when you come back." Tang Yao Yao told him the same thing when he came to the capital from Lingzhou to take the exam. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "We have known each other for so long, and you still don't understand me?" "Understood." Tang Yao Yao nodded and said, "Even if you have a thief's heart, you don't have the courage." Tang Ning took a shortcut over the wall and went back. Tang Yao Yao was standing in the yard. Xiu ran out of the room and said, "Miss, I found it. I found the meaning of the signature." Feng goes to Qin Tower, Yunli and Wushan. What we are talking about is not about cooking raw rice into cooked rice, but that it is not suitable for two people to marry and they should find another suitable partner. Tang Yao Yao stretched out his hand, knocked her on the head, and said, "Nothing is wrong with any bad sign. If you like something, go get it. If you like it, go after the person you like. Your own happiness must be in your own hands." In the early year of Dingyuan, it was the 3rd day of March. It's a good time to get married and travel. Today is the day when Princess Pingyang gets married. The procession will start from the capital and go north, with the final destination being the capital of Chu State. On the street, people who came to watch had already gathered on both sides of the street. Before the motorcade set off from the palace gate, the street had been cleared. On both sides, there were servants of major government offices and palace guards maintaining order. There was a huge crowd at the entrance of the palace. Today's morning ceremony was cancelled, but all the officials still had to gather within the specified time to watch the ceremony. The etiquette officers in the palace followed the royal etiquette and regulations, starting from the morning, one by one, in an orderly manner, and it has been more than an hour now. On one side of the square, somewhere in a curtain room, concubine Fang Shu held Zhao Man's hand and said, "Manner must learn to take care of herself in Chu State from now on, and can no longer be as willful as before." Zhao Man smiled and said, "Don't worry, Empress." There was a smile on her face, and her eyes looked in the other direction of the square from time to time. Princess Anyang stood beside her, looking in the same direction. In the square on the other side, there was a wedding envoy, 2 deputy envoys, the envoys from Chen and Chu, 800 guards, and including some handymen and servants, a team of nearly 1,000 people has been assembled. Is it a coincidence? A trace of surprise appeared on her face. When she looked at Zhao Man, she slowly said, "Master Tang." Zhao Man's eyes immediately looked at her. Princess Anyang smiled, pointed outside, and said, "Tang Shangshu of the Ministry of Rites has gone up." Zhao Man immediately looked away from her, looked outside, and murmured, "Why don't you leave?" Princess Anyang looked outside with a trace of disbelief on her face. As the wedding messenger, Tang Ning stood at the front of a group of nearly 1,000 people. Butcher Zheng and the 20 disciples of the beggar clan were all incorporated into his bodyguard by him. They were the core strength that he could use and rely on when he went to Chu State. The young man standing on his left who looked like a benchmark was Lu Tang, the son of the Minister of War, who commanded 800 guards and was responsible for the safety of this trip. On the other side is Honglu Si Chang. As the deputy envoy, although his power is not as great as Tang Ning's, he can still supervise and contain Tang Ning. According to Tang Ning's observation, this person had been flirting with several people in the entourage since just now, and they should all be his accomplices. Tang Ning wrote down the faces of those people one by one. When the princess leaves the capital, the royal family will naturally come to see her off. Zhao Yuan just ran over quietly and gave her a box of snacks. She told him that there was a famous rouge that was only sold in the capital of Chu, and asked him to help him when he came back. "Bring 8 boxes of 10. After Zhao Yuan ran away, King Kong walked over from the front with a smile. King Kong stood in front of him with his hands behind his back and said with a smile, "Master Tang, this trip is both for weddings and marriage proposals. Thank you for your hard work." Tang Ning knew that King Kong was reminding him not to forget about asking for marriage. When King Duan came over just now, he also whispered to Honglu Si Chang. Although King Duan only had 1 deputy envoy this time, there were many of his people in the accompanying envoys. It was understandable that King Kong was not at ease. There were many officials who came to see him off. Gu Bai, Kui Lang, and others came to say hello to him. Xiaoju came over and gave him a few words of advice before looking at Lu Teng and said, "The surname is Lu. You should be careful, if anything happens to the princess, you don't have to come back." Lu Teng looked up at him and said, "Shut your crow's mouth." Tang Ning watched Xiao Ju and Lu Teng arguing with interest as a figure slowly walked from the front. Fang Zhe walked up to him, glanced at him, and said, "I really want to see how far you can go." Fang Zhe said a word and left. Tang Ning looked at the extra envelope in her hand and quietly put it into her sleeve. From ahead, the eunuch's high-pitched and loud voice came over. "The auspicious time has arrived, let's set off immediately. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 344. The ceremony before departure lasted for nearly 2 hours. The group set out from the palace gate in a mighty procession. As they walked along, they could hear the cheers of the people. There were 800 palace guards responsible for protection, the princess's entourage, the servants who transported the dowry, and the envoys of the two countries. A total of nearly 1,000 people walked through the streets, with carriages and horses in a line and gongs and drums beating. It was also a rare scene. Tang Ning rode on a horse and walked in the front. It felt a bit like riding a horse in the imperial street, and it was also like a wedding. If he wore a big red flower on his chest and a wedding gown, it would be even more like it. When he reached the city gate, he saw Xiao Ru, Xiao Yi, and Tang Yao Yao standing somewhere. Xiao Xiao and Fang Xianyu waved to him desperately. He also saw Su Mei and her mother not far away, and Tang Shui standing alone in the distance, watching him leave. Tang Ning could only ride on the horse and wave in their direction, and each time he would be greeted with more enthusiastic cheers from the crowd. The princess's marriage is a national celebration, but the excitement will eventually fade. When the group of people left the city gate and gradually disappeared from sight, the onlookers gradually dispersed, leaving only scattered figures. Tang Qi stood outside the city gate, looking at a cloud of dust in the distance, and said lightly, "The dispute over the crown prince will be almost clear when they come back." Tang Zhao snorted coldly and said, "That guy went to Chu State, it's better not to come back." Tang Jing retracted his gaze from a distance and said, "Although we still have Lord He and the accompanying delegation, we have an advantage in numbers, but in the end, Tang Ning is the envoy seeking marriage. I hope everything goes well on this trip." Tang Jing looked ahead with a calm expression, and there was no emotional fluctuation. Tang Shui walked over from a distance and said, "Dad, everyone is gone, let's go back." Tang Jing nodded, and when he turned around to return to the city, he looked at a figure not far away and was suddenly startled. At the same time, Tang Qi seemed to have discovered something, his face changed, and he walked in a certain direction with big strides. At the city gate, Su Mei took the woman beside her and said, "Mom, let's go back." Ning left, and you can't sleep well. The woman looked at her and said, "Before he left some soothing spices. It is said that they are good things in the palace. I will sew them in a sachet after I go back. You can carry them with you." Su Mei smiled and said, "Thank you, mother." Xiao Yu, when they walked into the city gate, a voice suddenly came from behind. The woman's body trembled, her steps paused slightly, and the next moment, she walked forward with an unchanged expression. Tang Qi walked quickly to the two of them, and when he looked over, he couldn't help but be startled. Su Mei looked at Tang Qi and smiled, "It's Lord Tang." Miss Su Tang Qi had been to Tianrunju many times, so he naturally knew the most beautiful woman in the capital. He glanced at her, looked at the woman, and asked, "Who is this?" "My mother." Su Mei looked at him and asked, "Lord Tang, what's the matter?" "Nothing." Tang Qi shook his head and said, "It's just that Miss Su's mother looks a lot like one of my relatives. The world is so big, there are many people who look alike, it's not surprising." Su Mei took the woman's hand and said, "If Lord Tang has nothing to do, we'll leave first." Tang Jing walked over slowly, looked at the figure in front, and said, "Isn't that Miss Su from Tianrunju?" Tang Chi looked at the two figures in front and asked, "Do you think the woman next to her looks a lot like Xiao?" No, Tang Jing shook his head and said, "Although their figures are somewhat similar, their looks are not. There are at least 8,000 people in the capital who have figures similar to Xiao. How could Miss Su's mother be Xiao?" "I thought too much." Tang Chi nodded and said, "It's been so long, and I don't know where Xiao is. There is no news at all." Tang Chi got on the carriage. Tang Jing waved to him and said, "You go back first. I'm going to buy some candied fruit for Shui's mother and walk back by myself." Tang Shui came from behind and asked, "Dad, you buy the same candied fruit for mother every time? She has eaten it for so many years. Isn't she tired of it?" Tang Jing tapped her head with his fingers and said, "What do you know as a little girl? There are some things that you will never get tired of in your life." Tang Shui stuck out her tongue and said, "You go back to Coke's mother first. I'll go back later." "Go to Tianrunju again?" Tang Jing looked ahead and asked casually. Tang Shui was surprised and asked, "Dad, how did you know?" Tang Jing looked at her and asked, "The food at Tianrunju is so delicious, is it worth it for you to go there every day? Or are you very familiar with Miss Su Mei, more familiar with Princess Anyang?" Tang Shui looked up at him and opened her mouth, "Dad." Tang Jing looked away and said, "If it's really for your aunt's good, restrain yourself." "Dad, you." Tang Shui followed him. Tang Jing waved his hand and said, "Don't worry, they don't know yet." Tang Shui breathed a sigh of relief, lowered her head, and said after a long time, "Dad, who can be the emperor, Prince Kong or cousin Prince Duan?" Tang Jing looked at her and asked, "Why do you ask this suddenly?" Tang Shui whispered, "If cousin Prince Duan becomes the emperor, my aunt and their family will not be able to gain a foothold in the capital. If Prince Kong becomes the emperor, my aunt can appear openly, but the Tang family. The Tang family will be annihilated." Tang Jing added, and then laughed, "Who said that the emperor must be Prince Duan and Prince Kong? Maybe it will be some other prince. Before things are finalized, everything is possible." Tang Shui raised his head and asked, "But they all said that whoever can marry Princess Changning this time will firmly sit on the throne of the crown prince." "Who said that?" Tang Jing shook his head and said, "Whether it is marrying a princess or a princess, it is hard to predict the consequences." Tang Shui pulled his arm and asked, "What is hard to predict, Dad? Can't you explain it clearly?" "Your Majesty is betting." Tang Jing breathed a sigh of relief and said, "He is betting on both the Crown Prince of Chu to win and the Regent of Chu to win. If the Crown Prince of Chu wins, the prince who married Princess Changning will not be crowned as the Crown Prince. If the Regent of Chu wins, the prince who marries Princess Changning will step into the East Palace, but Princess Pingyang who marries him will be sacrificed for him. Your Majesty bet on both sides, and they only bet on one side, so even if the marriage proposal is successful, it is still unknown whether it is a blessing or a curse for them." Tang Shui was stunned for a while before he came back to his senses and asked, "So, those who support the Regent of Chu will not support the Prince of Chu marrying Princess Pingyang? Are they in danger along the way?" "It's far more than that." Tang Jing shook his head and said, "There are people who don't want to see the marriage between Chen and Chu more than them. They are destined to have a rough journey." Tang Shui was stunned in place, his fists clenched in his sleeves, his nails deeply embedded in the flesh. "Chu. Prince Xian's mansion." A young man strode in from the door, walked into the hall, bowed, and said, "Your Highness, an urgent report from the state of Chen. The state of Chen has agreed to the marriage proposal, and Princess Pingyang will set off on the 3rd day of March." "The 3rd day of March," the middle-aged man in green put down his teacup and said, "So, they have been on the road for several days." The young man nodded and said, "Counting the days, they have already set off 5 days ago." The middle-aged man picked up the teacup again and said, "In this case, we have to start preparing here immediately." The young man raised his head and said, "Your Highness, there is one more thing." The middle-aged man looked at him and asked, "What is it?" The young man said, "According to the envoy, the emperor of the state of Chen intends to let a prince marry Princess Changning, and he has also sent an envoy to propose marriage this time." "Want to marry Lanlin?" The middle-aged man put down the teacup heavily and said coldly, "He is dreaming." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 345. There is only one palace in the capital of Chu, which is the Xinwang Palace. Unlike Chen, the emperors of Chu would appoint a crown prince early. Other princes would go to their respective fiefdoms after they came of age. Without a transfer order, they were not allowed to return to the capital or build a palace in the capital. But Xinwang was different. As the brother of the current majesty and the regent of a country, Xinwang was transferred back to the capital from his fiefdom when the majesty ascended the throne, and was entrusted with important tasks, becoming the only exception in Chu for decades. And Xinwang did not disappoint the majesty. Over the years, he worked with the majesty to maintain peace at home and abroad, making the national strength of Chu flourishing. Since the majesty was ill and stayed away from the court, he managed the court inside and outside in an orderly manner, and everyone was convinced. Because of this, Xinwang also accumulated unparalleled prestige in Chu, far exceeding that of the crown prince. Now the crown prince is incompetent, and there are voices in the court and among the people to let Xinwang replace him. However, in addition to helping His Majesty manage state affairs, Prince Xian did not do anything beyond the limit. Instead, he often taught the prince and delegated power to him. As a result, the people and court officials all admired Prince Xian even more, and the call for him to replace the prince became even louder. In Prince Xian's mansion, the most powerful man in Chu put the teacup heavily on the table and said disdainfully, "The princes of Chen are more useless than each other, and they still want to marry my daughter." The young man standing below smiled bitterly and said, "Your Majesty, this time the envoys sent by Chen to ask for marriage are probably difficult to deal with, and Chen has already sent Princess Pingyang to marry him. Marry her here. With the diplomatic relations between the two countries, even your Majesty cannot refuse this matter." Prince Xian snorted coldly and said, "Marry Princess Pingyang here and want to marry my daughter back. Zhao Zheng, this old fox, is really good at calculating. He pretends to be kind and righteous on the surface, but when he uses his own daughter as a bargaining chip, his subordinates are not merciful at all." He walked out of the door and asked, "Where is the princess?" The young man said, "In the back garden." Because the princess likes flowers and plants, the back garden of Prince Xian's mansion is very large. It is mid-March now. The flowers in the garden are in full bloom, and the air is filled with a sweet fragrance. The woman in white held the sword in one hand, and the long sword in her hand danced like a spirit snake. After a moment, she made a beautiful sword flower, looked at the middle-aged man standing in the pavilion, and asked, "How come father has time to come here today?" The middle-aged man said, "There is nothing to do in the court, I came to appreciate the flowers and tell you two news by the way." Li Tianlan sheathed the long sword, looked at him, and asked, "What news?" "The Emperor of Chen agreed to our marriage proposal and has sent people to escort Princess Pingyang. She will arrive in Kyoto in 2 months at the fastest and 3 months at the slowest." Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "What's the other one?" The middle-aged man said, "The Emperor of Chen also sent an envoy to ask for marriage from your Majesty and let you marry to Chen." "No," Li Tianlan said simply. "Of course not." Prince Xian shook his head and said, "My daughter has won the first place in the imperial examination and is both civil and military. Who in the whole Chen kingdom is worthy of you?" As if he remembered something, he said, "I heard that Chen kingdom had a champion who won the first place in the imperial examination last year. He is a talent. You happened to be in the capital during the imperial examination. Are you familiar with that person?" Li Tianlan's face moved slightly and said, I am familiar with him. Even if he is also a champion in the imperial examination, he is not worthy of you in terms of status. He looked at Li Tianlan and said, but Lanlan, there are men in the world who are smarter and better in martial arts than you. Are you really not going to lower your requirements? Let's talk about it later. Li Tianlan waved his hand and walked out of the garden. The middle-aged man looked behind him and asked the young man, who did you say was the envoy sent by Chen Kingdom to send the marriage this time? The young man bowed and said, Tang Ning, the doctor of the Ministry of Rites and the bachelor of the Hanlin Academy. Prince's mansion. There was singing and dancing in the palace. A young man was lying on a soft couch, and a woman in light clothes beside him put pieces of cut fruits and vegetables into his mouth. A figure hurried in from outside the palace and said, Your Highness, there is an urgent report. The young man on the couch waved his hand, and a woman came up with a wine glass. He took the wine glass and rinsed his mouth before saying, Speak. The person said, Your Highness, Chen State agreed to the marriage, and Princess Pingyang has set off. She should arrive before June. I know. The young man looked at the beautiful dancing of several women in the palace, and his expression could not tell whether he was happy or angry. The man said again, Your Highness, there is one more thing, you will be happy to hear it. The young man looked at him and asked, Oh, what is it? The man smiled and said, Your Highness, the Chen Kingdom delegation is not only here to send the bride, they also want to marry Princess Changning. The young man immediately became excited and asked, Is there such a thing? It is true. The man nodded and said, In order to strengthen the diplomatic relations between the two countries, the Emperor Chen wants Princess Changning to marry a prince of Chen Kingdom, and has sent a marriage envoy here. The young man smiled. He had been dissatisfied with his cousin for a long time. The girl did not learn needlework and embroidery, but went to the imperial examination. Everyone in the capital knew that Princess Changning was a first-class woman in the world with literary talent and military strategy. No man in Chu could match her. In addition, there was actually another sentence at the end, although Princess Changning was a girl, she was much better than that useless prince. And he was that useless prince. It would be fine if those people said he was not as good as Prince Xian, but they actually said he was not as good as a woman. Did they consider the feelings of the prince? A man behind the young man stepped forward and said, Your Highness, Princess Changning is the only daughter of Prince Xian. I'm afraid Prince Xian will not agree. Disagree? The young man shook his head and said, Uncle Prince Xian is so sensible, how could he not agree? It is a matter concerning the diplomatic relations between the two countries and the people of the two countries. How could he not agree? He sneered and said, If he really disagrees, that would be great. Chen State, a state in the north, on the official road. Dozens of carriages moved slowly forward. It had been a month since they left the capital. Everyone was covered in dust, but the atmosphere was not dull. Along the way, they were not in a hurry to travel. They traveled for 6 hours every day. When they encountered a city, they would rest for a day or half a day. Most people were in high spirits. According to the current speed of travel, they would arrive at Fengzhou in about half a month. Fengzhou is the northernmost city of Chen State. After leaving Fengzhou, they would reach the border of Chu State. Tang Ning sat in a luxurious carriage. Under the curtain, a slender little hand secretly stretched out. Tang Ning took the candied fruit she handed over and put it in his mouth. After riding a horse for 3 days outside the capital, his butt was so painful that he couldn't stand it, so he sat outside Zhao Man's carriage. She originally wanted Tang Ning to go in and rest, but outside the capital, this carriage was the princess's boudoir, and he, an outsider, naturally couldn't go in. Honglu Temple secretary Hirui was staring at him in the carriage behind, hoping that something would happen to him. It was not comfortable to be stared at like this all day. Tang Ning wanted to find an opportunity to arrange him, but He Duan was cautious and usually didn't come out to see him, so he couldn't find an opportunity to attack for a while. Along the way, Lu Teng was loyal to his duties and did a good job of defense, but if you think about it carefully, there was actually nothing to defend. There were nearly 1,000 people in the team, and 800 of them were fully armed Imperial guards. Not to mention small thieves, no matter which mountain bandit force saw them, they would have to stay away. There were 800 guards in the territory of Chen State, so there was no need to worry about any security issues. However, He Duan and the envoys arranged by Prince Duan would appear in front of him from time to time, which made him feel annoyed. A figure came from the front, bowed to him, and said, "Lord Tang." In addition to the servants and guards, there were also 2 imperial doctors in the team this time. Tang Ning looked at him and asked casually, "Dr. Wang, what are you doing?" Dr. Wang said, "Lord Kui is not feeling well, I'm going to see him." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Lord Kui is sick, if it's serious, let him recover here. It doesn't matter if one person is missing. Health is important." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 346. It shouldn't be serious. Dr. Wang was startled and said, "Master Kui and the others are civil servants. It's normal for the carriage and horses to be bumpy on the road and to feel uncomfortable. After a good night's rest, it should be fine by tomorrow." Tang Ning jumped off the carriage, patted his shoulder and said, "Dr. Wang, you have just entered the Imperial Hospital not long ago." Tang Ning's actions flattered Dr. Wang, and he quickly said, "Xiaoguan has just been admitted to Tai Hospital for 2 years. Although the Taiyuan Hospital is not in the same system as the various ministries of the imperial court, the person in front of them is not only a close minister of the emperor, but also the uncle of the imperial physician Chen Ling, and a guest of the imperial physician Chen. The entire Taiyuan Hospital has received his favor. Wang Yuyi has considerable respect for this official who is much younger than him." Tang Ning looked at him and said solemnly, "It doesn't seem serious, but it's actually very serious. If you think about it, we have walked all the way. You are fine, I am fine, and even the princess with the body of gold is at peace with me. Nothing happened. Why did Mr. Kui get sick?" Dr. Wang thought for a while and said, "It may be that Mr. Kui is weak." Tang Ning nodded and said, "This weak person is different from us. This trip still has nearly 2 months to go. If Mr. Kui dies of illness on the way, the loss to the court will be difficult for both Dr. Wang and me to bear. Take the blame. It's unlikely that he died of illness." Dr. Wang looked at him, and suddenly a look of surprise appeared on his face. He nodded and said, "Don't worry, sir. I understand." A moment later, in a carriage in the convoy, He Rui, the Prime Minister of Honglu Temple, looked at the royal physician Wang and said hurriedly, "Dr. Wang, how is Master Kui?" "Master Kui's health is not optimistic." Dr. Wang shook his head and said, "If we continue, I'm afraid my life will be in danger." He Rui's expression changed and he asked, "What, is it so serious?" An official sitting in the carriage trembled and couldn't figure out what to do. "Dr. Wang, you may have taken the wrong pulse, right?" I'm just a little dizzy and nauseous." Dr. Wang shook his head and said, "The beginning of a serious illness is nothing more than a minor illness. Mr. Kui might as well think about it. Mr. He is not dizzy and nauseated along the way. Mr. Zheng is not dizzy and nauseated. Mr. Kui, you are the only one who is unwell." When the official surnamed Kui heard this, his face immediately turned pale. Dr. Wang continued, "The best way now is for Master Kui to stop and recuperate for a few days to avoid fatigue when encountering the next town. Otherwise, Master Kui's body will not be able to survive even a month." He Rui looked at Dr. Wang, frowned and said, "Master He, are you being a little alarmist? The carriage is bumpy, dizziness and nausea are human nature. I was not feeling well yesterday. I will be fine after a day of rest." "What's wrong?" Tang Ning walked over from the front and asked, "What's going on?" Dr. Wang said, Master Kui is feeling a little unwell. The official suggested that he stop and recuperate, otherwise his life will be in danger. Hirudeo said, what Dr. Wang said is too serious. This trip has a huge responsibility. How can we delay it because of such trivial matters? Tang Ning nodded and said, Master, he is right, a slight injury cannot leave the battlefield. This is outside, not in the capital. You can rest whenever you want. If something really happens to Master Kui, this officer will bear the responsibility. Hirui was startled when he heard this. He didn't expect that Tang Ning would actually follow him and say, didn't he regard them as a thorn in his side and wanted to get rid of them one by one? Tang Ning looked at the official surnamed Kui and asked, I'm afraid Mr. Kui doesn't want to delay the wedding ceremony. Don't worry, if Mr. Kui does have an accident, the court will definitely treat your family well. The official surnamed Kui paled. It was important to see off his bride, but no matter how important it was not as important as his own life. The wedding sender Tang Ning regarded them as a thorn in his side. Even Dr. Wang said that he needed a good rest, but he still insisted on rushing. Wasn't this because he wanted to kill him? When the time comes, all they need to do is label them as overworked and acclimatized, and what will the court do to them? The official surnamed Kui's thoughts were racing. The next moment, he covered his mouth, frowned, and said, Master Tang, Master He, I'm the official. I suddenly felt a severe pain in my heart and my head was getting dizzy. I'd better give in. Please stop at the next town so as not to drag down the bride-to-be team. Tang Ning frowned and said, is Mr. Kui's illness really that serious? Why don't you try again? If something really happens, I and Mr. He will definitely try to get more pension money for the Kui family. Cough, cough. The official surnamed Kui had already determined that Tang Ning wanted his life. He coughed a few times and panted, two adults, Kui's life is not a big deal. If the adults who are traveling with him also, if I contract the disease, my sin will be great. Tang Ning looked at him, thought for a moment, then looked at Hirui and said, what do you think, Mr. He? Although he is the first in command, when something happens, asking the second in command for his opinion is also a sign of respect for the other person. Hirui thought for a while, then gritted his teeth and said, in that case, when we get to the next city, Mr. Kui should take good care of his health first. Although he was reluctant in his heart, if he still persisted at this time, Mr. Kui might have other thoughts about him. The official surnamed Kui breathed a sigh of relief, cupped his hands and said, thank you, Mr. Tang, and thank you, Mr. He. Tang Ning returned to the carriage, took out a small notebook from the corner of the carriage, and crossed an X on the name of an official named Kui. The delegation accompanying Chen Guo this time was all for the purpose of seeking marriage, and only one of them was taken away on the way. Tang Ning herself did not understand why he wanted to take away the envoy seeking marriage. Maybe it's because bad people get addicted to marriage after doing it too much. A head popped out of the carriage. Zhao Man looked at him and asked curiously, what are you doing? Tang Ning closed the book, pushed her head back, and said, you are a princess, how can you be so sneaky? Someone moved in the carriage, and then Tang Ning found Zhao Man leaning against him through the curtain. She rubbed him against him twice before saying, it's so boring to stay in the carriage all day. Can we go out and have some fun? Although there were many stops along the way, except for resting at the inn, she spent most of the time in the carriage. She might have been exhausted. Tang Ning thought about it and said, I will take you with me when I enter the city next time go out. It's a deal. Inside the carriage, Zhao Man immediately became energetic. After a while, a small plate of cut fruit was handed out. She tugged on Tang Ning's clothes and said, how about we rest for 2 days, walk. They didn't travel long every day. When they encountered places with inns, they could live in them. Where there were no inns, they would camp on the spot before dark. When they arrived at the slightly larger city of a certain state, it was already 2 days later. In the past 2 days, there had been many accidents. In addition to the sick official Kui, there was also an envoy who had diarrhea and collapsed. Tang Ning had no choice but to leave him in a town on the way. Please, the two looked at it. Today, another envoy had a high fever and was probably unable to continue traveling with them. In the spirit of humanitarianism, Tang Ning also planned to let him recuperate here. Within the inn, Hirui looked at the pale and extremely weak official lying on the bed, and said seriously, "We have only been gone for a month, and 3 people were left on the road. How can we complete the important task I was asked to do?" As soon as he finished speaking, someone walked in quickly from outside the door and said anxiously, "Master He, please go out and take a look. Master Zhang was bitten by some poisonous insect. His arms are swollen as thick as his thighs." "What?" Hirui shook his body and almost fainted. Tang Ning was drinking tea in her room when someone came up to report that Deputy Hirui asked to see him. Tang Ning put down her teacup, looked at Hirui who walked in from the door, and asked, "Sir He, what's wrong? Is there another person who is sick?" Hirui looked at him and said bravely, "Mr. Chen has contracted the cold and Mr. Zhang has been bitten by a poisonous insect. The number of people in the mission is not enough. I want to rest here for a while and wait for them to recover from their injuries before leaving." Tang Ning looked at him, frowned and said, "Master He, I'm afraid this is not in compliance with the regulations." Hirui gritted his teeth and said, "The official feels that we have been out of Beijing for more than a month, and beyond that is the northern border. The soldiers also need to have a good rest and recuperate in order to cope with the journey ahead." "That makes sense." Tang Ning looked at him, nodded and said, "Then let's rest for 3 days. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 347. Although I was not in a hurry on this journey, after marching for a month, a few days of short rest could also allow the soldiers who were highly nervous along the way to relax a little. What's more, there are 2 envoys who are in some physical condition and need to rest. If Tang Ning refuses Hirui's request, it will appear that he is an unreasonable superior and is not conducive to the cohesion of the entire team. The most important thing is that he promised Zhao Yingying to take her out to play. "Then I'll thank you, Mr. Tang." Hirui raised his head and cupped his hands, turned around and retreated. Not long after Hirui went out, Lu Tang strode in. As soon as he entered the door, he looked at Tang Ning and said straight to the point, "Master Tang, why do we have to stay in Yunzhou for 3 days? I think there is absolutely no need to delay the trip like this. We only need to rest for 1 night and we can set off early tomorrow morning." Tang Ning looked at him and explained, "The soldiers have traveled for so long and have worked hard. Staying here for 3 days will allow them to take turns and have a good rest. What's more, 2 of the envoys in the mission are ill. We also need to rest. 2 envoys have already had an accident along the way. If 2 more envoys delay important events when they arrive in Chu, the court will blame them." Although Lu Teng was a straight man, he was not stubborn. After thinking about it, he agreed to the arrangement and went out to set up defenses. Along the way, he didn't talk much, but he never slacked off on his duties. Tang Ning sat down to rest for a while, then a young palace maid walked in and said, "Master Tang, Princess, please come over." She promised to take Zhao Man out for a walk when she arrived at the next city. She had just arrived and she couldn't wait any longer. Zhao Man was pacing in the room. When she saw him coming in, she immediately asked, "How do we get out?" Along the way, she wanted to go out for a walk more than once, but was stopped by Lu Teng. Although she is a princess, Lu Teng is responsible for the safety of this trip, and she still has to listen to him on these matters. Lu Teng was conscientious in his duties as a guard. This inn, especially Zhao Man's yard, was surrounded by 3 floors inside and 3 floors outside. It was almost impossible to take her out without anyone noticing. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "I'll go talk to Lu Teng first." "No, outside the courtyard," Tang Ning just spoke. Lu Teng refused without thinking, and said flatly, "How can the princess risk going out with a rich body? What if something happens?" Tang Ning said, "Commander Lu can send more guards to follow." Lu Teng shook his head resolutely and said, "No, if something happens to the princess, we cannot bear the responsibility. Forget about it." Tang Ning waved his hand. Along the way, he also understood Lu Teng's character. Even 10 cows couldn't change what the other party decided, so he didn't need to waste his words here. He walked back into the room. Zhao Man looked at him and asked, "How is it? Did he agree?" Tang Ning shook her head. "Forget it." Although Zhao Man was a little disappointed, she still looked at him and said, "If you are caught sneaking out, my father will punish you when you return." Tang Ning thought for a moment, looked at her and said, "Wait a moment. People always come up with solutions. When she was in the palace, she was like a canary in a cage. Now that she has left Beijing, it's time to fly out of the cage. When traveling in the world, having many skills does not weigh you down." This is the truth that Tang Ning has always believed in. Therefore, he learned poison from the old beggar, learned gu from Sumei, learned how to climb over the wall from Tang Yao Yao, and learned makeup from Xiu'er. Xiu'er is extremely talented and can transform one person into another through makeup, which is enough to make the fake look real. Tang Ning is not as good as her, but she has learned her 67 skills, which is enough to cope with most situations. Zhao Man watched Tang Ning put a box on the table and took out things like rouge and gouache, and asked curiously, "What is this for?" Tang Ning washed her hands and dried them, then looked at her and said, "Sit tight." Zhao Man sat upright and asked, "Do you want to put makeup on me?" Tang Ning first applied a layer of foundation evenly on her face. Zhao Man couldn't help but giggle and said, "It's itchy." The foundation powder used for women's makeup includes rice powder, lead powder, mercury powder, etc. The powder Tang Ning uses is pearl powder. She applies a light layer on it, and then applies blush. In comparison, Tang Ning still prefers light makeup. So I only applied a shallow layer. The third step of drawing eyebrows is the most important step. Tang Ning has done it for Xiao Ru Xiaoi many times, but if she wants to deceive others, Zhao Man still has to spend some effort. "Close your eyes," he thought for a moment and reminded her before slowly writing. Zhao Man sat there quietly, then suddenly opened his eyes and blinked at him. Tang Ning looked at her eyebrows carefully and said, "Close your eyes first, otherwise the drawing will not look good." "I want to just look at you like this." Zhao Man looked at him, eyes flashing with light, and said, "It would be great if I could look at you forever." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Okay, I got it. Close your eyes quickly." A girl's love is blind. Tang Ning will not expose her beautiful fantasy. When she grows up, she may be able to understand some things. Half an hour later, Tang Ning rubbed her sore wrist and said, "Okay." Zhao Man stood up, looked at the woman in the bronze mirror, opened her mouth in surprise, and turned to look at the little palace maid standing beside her. The little palace maid looked at the face across from her that was somewhat similar to hers, and stammered, "Princess, princess." When Tang Ning walked out of the courtyard, she saw Lu Teng standing outside the courtyard with a knife. "The princess has gone to bed." Tang Ning looked at him, then at the little palace maid behind her who had her head lowered, and said, "Don't forget the things the princess wants to buy." The little palace maid whispered, "Yes." Lu Teng's eyes swept over the little palace maid, looked at the group of soldiers passing by, and said loudly, "Cheer up." Zhao Man dressed as a little palace maid walked on the street, licking a candied hawes, jumping every 3 steps, and she was obviously in a happy mood. Tang Ning walked beside her and once again realized how useful having another skill was. She suddenly stopped, sniffed, and said, "What does it smell like?" "It smells so good." Tang Ning also smelled a fragrance. Following the fragrance, she looked over and found a bean seller on the roadside. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 348. In the Imperial Study Room, Emperor Chen was also stunned. He looked at Princess Anyang and said, "What exactly happened? Please tell me slowly." Anyang was mature and sensible, and was deeply loved by the Queen Mother. Although she was the princess, Emperor Chen treated her better than ordinary princesses. Princess Anyang wiped away her tears, her voice slightly choked, and said, "Someone said dirty words to Anyang, not only wanting to beat Anyang, but also insulting the royal family." Emperor Chen's face darkened and he said, "Who is so bold?" Princess Anyang pointed to Zhao Qiagong and said, "It is Zhao Qiagong's son Zhou Cheng. Not only did he instruct his servants to beat us, he also said he would kill the 9 tribes in Anyang." Duke Zhao Guo stood in the hall, sweating heavily and his back was soaked with sweat. "It's enough to insult the princess. To kill her 9 clans is to kill the royal family. Isn't it rebellion? The Zhou family cannot afford such a crime." He knelt down with a pop and said urgently, "Your Majesty, my son will never say such treacherous words." "Princess, you can't slander my son like this." Princess Anyang wiped her tears, lowered her head and said, "He ordered his servants to whip us with whips, and also said many unpleasant words." I vaguely remember the sentence. Zhou Wu's body was trembling. Princess Anyang's words were specious, so he couldn't refute. I vaguely remember. This was an attempt to incriminate. Emperor Chen looked at Zhou Wu and said, "What a good son my uncle taught me." Zhou Wu did not dare to explain at all. He looked horrified, knelt on the ground, and said loudly, "I failed to teach my son well, and I am guilty." Chen Huang waved his hand and said, "For the sake of the Queen Mother, I will not care about this matter with him. You go back and discipline him more. If he does it again, I will not be lenient." Zhou Wu knelt down and said, "I obey the decree." Duke Zhao panicked and retreated. Tang Ning glanced at Princess Anyang. What happened that day was obviously not what Princess Anyang said. According to her, after Tang Shui started fighting with those people, she hid aside. Zhou Qing, who came later, didn't see her at all. Otherwise, how could he give Princess Anyang some face? As for Tang Shui, the Tang family has declined to this point, and the capital which has become a thing of the past, but Zhou Qing has not taken it seriously. Emperor Chen looked at Princess Anyang and said, "Although Zhou Qing offended you, he has also been punished. Let this end here." Princess Anyang said obediently, "Listen to Uncle Huang." Chen Huang nodded and said, "Anyang will go down first, Tang Ning will stay." Princess Anyang glanced at Tang Ning, turned around and walked out of the imperial study. Tang Ning stood in the palace, waiting for Emperor Chen to speak. Emperor Chen paced in the palace and said, "The imperial court wants to send troops to help the countries in the western regions and resist Zioan. The actions of those in the capital should really stop. I thought about it and think what you and King Huai said makes sense. Our country, Chen, is a country of etiquette and cannot imitate the barbarians. From now on, they are strictly prohibited from plundering the people of the western regions and selling them back to Beijing." Tang Ning cupped her hands and said, "Your Majesty is wise. The western region is very big, and Zioan is the most dangerous place for those people. When they arrive in the western region, they don't care which country they are in. They are like robbers, robbing everyone they see. Now Chen State and many small countries in the western region have achieved this. If the cooperative relationship continues like this, it will cause dissatisfaction among the allies. This is also the reason why there are so many people in the court who support him and King Huai. Huang Chen asked his opinion on several major events that had happened in the DPRK recently. He felt sleepy after a while and waved to Tang Ning to leave. King Kang's rebellion was a serious blow to Chen Guo. In the past, he seemed to be tireless when reviewing memorials and talking about state affairs. Now he looks a little haggard and has aged much in a short period of time. Tang Ning walked out of the imperial study room, and Princess Anyang was standing in front waiting for him. When she saw Tang Ning approaching, she raised an eyebrow and asked, "How is it?" Perfect. Tang Ning nodded, convinced by her acting skills just now. If he hadn't known it beforehand, he might have believed her lies. Princess Anyang asked, "Is that all?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "There is no need to pay back the 10,000 taels of silver." Although Princess Anyang's acting skills just now were impeccable, the reward of 10,000 taels for just a few minutes of performance was definitely worthy of the tears she just shed. 10,000 taels of silver can solve an urgent need, but it will eventually be spent. Princess Anyang has seen how wealthy he is today. If he can treat her like Tang Shui, won't she never have to worry about money in the future? Already. What a wonderful thing. Princess Anyang showed a warm smile on her face and said, "If it weren't for me today, you would have suffered the consequences of Zhao Qiuagong. You see, you won't suffer so much if you call me sister, right?" Tang Ning could tell that Princess Anyang was not satisfied with the 10,000 taels of silver. What she wanted was more 10,000 taels. If he really recognized the sister, Fairy Tang would definitely not let him go. Of course, Tang Ning herself was not willing to be taken advantage of. He shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, I can only have one sister." Princess Anyang looked at him and said angrily, "How can I be inferior to Shui-er?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "She is still my fiancée, you are not." Princess Anyang looked at Tang Ning leaving, her chest rising and falling. Although she wanted money, she didn't want to involve herself in it for the sake of money. She glared angrily in the direction Tang Ning left, gritted her teeth and said, "What a bastard." Zhou family. Zhou Wu returned home, walked to Zhou Qing's bed, and said angrily, "Did you insult Princess Anyang that day?" Zhou Qing looked innocent and said, "I didn't see her at all that day." Zhou Wuodao, she was in the palace just now, saying that you said dirty words to her and wanted to punish her 9 tribes. Zhou Qing trembled and said loudly, "She is slandering. I didn't see her at all that day, let alone said those words. At that time, there was only that woman from the Tang family. The Tang family is gone now, so I let them and him hands on. In that case, why did Princess Anyang want to excuse him?" Zhou Wu looked suspicious and murmured, "Did they get together?" Zhou Qing looked at him and asked, "Dad, does the court really not allow us to go to the western regions to arrest people? What about those people who have been captured?" Zhou Wu had a look of reluctance on his face and said, "Let's move them to another place first." Snatching slaves from the western regions and selling them to dignitaries in the capital was the Zhou family's biggest financial source. In the process, they also had to take risks. The western region is vast and sparsely populated. It only takes 100 people to form a strong force. These hundreds of people are enough to deal with a small country with a small population, but a big country like Zioan is not so easy to mess with. If you are not careful, you may even be in danger of being wiped out. Zhou Wu was depressed, and some servants came to report it. Several dignitaries from the capital came to visit. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 349. What is this? I've never seen it before. Buy it and try it. This looks delicious. I bought these and this. Women and strong men dressed in strange clothes walked on the street, which naturally attracted the attention of countless people. She ignored this at all and bought all the snacks on the street stalls before finally walking into a remote inn. The inn looked dilapidated, and the door was ajar. She pushed the door open, and several figures in the room immediately stood up, folded their hands on their chests, bowed slightly, and babbled a few words, which seemed to be what unknown language. The woman asked in the same language, and one of them immediately pointed upstairs. When the giant man who followed her in opened the leather bag around his waist and showed off to the people in the house, the woman had already gone up the stairs. When she walked to a door somewhere, she knocked on the door and pushed the door open. A middle-aged woman was sitting at the table. When she walked over, the middle-aged woman asked, "Have you heard about it?" The woman stood there, stunned, and asked, "Inquire about what?" The middle-aged woman looked at the remaining candied haws in her hand and asked, "I asked you to inquire about Chen Guo's mission. Are you just focusing on buying food again?" "I forgot, but Han people's food is really delicious." The woman looked at the candied haws in her hand, handed it over with some reluctance, and said, "Do you want to eat it?" The convoy of the Chen state escorting Princess Pingyang to the Chu state for marriage has arrived in Yunzhou. The middle-aged woman looked at her and said, "Once the Chen state and the Chu state complete the marriage, they will be as close as one family. When the time comes, the two countries will mobilize their troops to attack grassland. Your cattle and sheep will be snatched away by them, your horses will be snatched away by them, and your women and children will be snatched away by them." When the woman heard this, a look of anger appeared on her face, and she gritted her teeth and said, "Cunning Han people, absolutely, we cannot let them get, how do you say that in Chinese?" The middle-aged woman looked at her and said, "Go and copy the word success 100 times." The woman's face immediately fell. The weather in March and April is the most comfortable. The weather is gradually getting warmer, and there is a hint of coolness in the breeze. Zhao Man took off his shoes and socks, sat on the stone by the stream, raised his feet, and the water splashed everywhere. I ran barefoot to the grass and was very happy because I caught a butterfly. A clean white cloth was spread on the grass, with various snacks bought from the street just now placed on it. Tang Ning put her hands behind her head and lay on the grass, watching the white clouds drifting past in the sky. It has been more than a month since we left Beijing, but we are not even halfway through the journey, and there will be about half a month before we enter the Chu kingdom. Going further, we reach the northernmost part of the Chen kingdom. The further north we go, the weaker the imperial court's control over the place becomes, and naturally the more chaotic it becomes. If someone wants to stop the marriage, they will definitely choose to do so in this section. Although these people have the same purpose as him, they cannot be allowed to succeed. In name, he is also the wedding messenger on this trip, and his responsibility is to deliver the princess safely to the capital of Chu. If anything goes wrong along the way, he will have to bear the main responsibility, and he cannot escape it. However, when he arrived in Chu state, his mission was completed, and naturally he didn't have so many scruples. Whether it was robbing people or stealing people, it had nothing to do with him, but was the responsibility of the Chu state court. He was lying on the grass with his eyes closed and basking in the sun, and suddenly he heard the sound of whoosh and whoosh coming from the wind in the air. He sat up and saw that Zhao Man had picked up a cane from somewhere and was waving it vigorously. She came over carrying the cane and said, "The young lady I met today is so powerful. I also want to learn how to swing a whip. When I learn how to do it, if that damn peach still scares me with her snake, I will use a whip to whip her." Zhao Yingying was still worried about Xiao Tao scaring her with a snake. He seemed to be thinking of the majestic look of the woman just now, with a look of longing and expectation on his face. Tang Ning stood up, took the whip from her hand, and said, "Girls, don't play with whips. She is still young and has not yet fully established her three views. It is best not to touch whips, candles, and the like. A woman who likes whips is more or less like a queen. Whoever marries a woman who is skilled in whipping skills will have a lively life in the rest of her life. But there's nothing to do anymore." Zhao Man clapped his hands, lay down next to Tang Ning, and said, "How about you tell me a story?" I haven't listened to a story for a long time. As long as she doesn't play with the whip, everything will be fine. Tang Ning nodded and said, then what do you want to hear? Zhao Man lay on the grass, looked at him sideways, and said, I like to hear everything you say. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, then let's talk about the deer and the cauldron. Although marriage is a national matter, nothing is absolute, and she still needs to relieve some psychological pressure. Butcher Zheng was leaning under a tree not far away, with his butcher knife beside him, looking into the distance with deep eyes. On the grass beside the stream, young men and women lay side by side with their hands behind their heads. There was a cool breeze by the stream and white clouds in the sky. Tang Ning turned over his memory and recounted a legendary story. Zhao Man hummed softly. Tune, with a satisfied look on his face. The original text of the novel has more than 1 million words. Of course, Tang Ning cannot tell it all. She only explains the context of the story clearly, focusing especially on the part about Princess Jianning's marriage. The purpose is to let Zhao Man regain some confidence. As he was talking, he suddenly felt no movement around him. He turned his head and saw Zhao Man's eyes rolling around, as if she was thinking about something. After thinking for a while, she looked up at Tang Ning and asked, Princess Jianning, are you talking about me? Tang Ning glanced at her and asked, do you think you look like her? No. Zhao Man shook her head and said, I am much more ladylike than her. She thought about it again and suddenly asked, if I kill the Prince of Chu, won't the marriage be impossible? No. Tang Ning ruthlessly shattered her fantasy. There was only one prince in Chu. If the prince became a eunuch, Chu would probably immediately break up with Chen and become irreconcilable. The envoys who went to Chu this time would never come back. Then I'll listen to you. Zhao Man sat up and said, but why did Wei Xiaobao marry so many women? He's too lustful. This is something that needs to be asked of the author. In addition to Wei Xiaobao, he knew a senior named Li who also married many women. It seems that there are many authors who like this style. Tang Ning did not answer, but Zhao Man suddenly seemed to think of something. She lowered her head and her face turned red. Although Princess Jianning was a princess, she still married Xiaobao in the end. Was he hinting something to her? Although the emperor would not agree, they could also go to a place where no one could find them and be happy together. After telling the story, it was almost time. When they went back, Zhao Man seemed to have something on her mind and was absent-minded. Tang Ning took her back, and no one noticed. Unless there was an accident, no one would enter the room where the princess was. After sending her back, he returned to the street. The girl selling tofu pudding was packing up her stall. Tang Ning walked over. The girl saw him and immediately said, my lady, I'm here to meet you. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, boss, would you like to sell me your tofu pudding secret recipe? I want to buy it. The girl said quickly, if you like it, I'll give you the secret recipe. Anyway, I'm leaving Yunzhou soon, so there's no point in keeping it. As she spoke, she bent down and pulled out a small box from under the table and chair. After opening it, she took out a yellowed piece of paper from the innermost part and said, this secret recipe is an heirloom in my family. If you don't mind, please accept it. Tang Ning took the paper, opened it and took out a silver note from his arms, put it on the table, and said, this money is for buying the secret recipe. Keep it, young lady. The girl looked at the 100 liang silver note on the table and immediately said, sir, this is not allowed, not allowed. I like the taste of this tofu pudding. Since you are leaving Yunzhou, you should accept the silver note. You can find another livelihood in another place. After Tang Ning said this, she waved her hand and turned away. The family secret recipe is a means of livelihood for others. Many people regard it as more important than their lives. Buying someone else's secret recipe is a bit excessive, but Zhao Yingying likes it, so Tang Ning can only give her a relatively generous compensation. He was walking on the street, and at a certain moment, a voice suddenly came from behind him. Stop. He turned his head and saw the foreign woman he met today chasing him quickly. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 350. Remember 3Q Chinese website in 1 second, read wonderful novels for free without pop-ups. Majesty, domineering, wise and mighty, tall and majestic, this was Tang Ning's impression of the emperor before traveling through time. After traveling through time, Chen Huan completely overturned his understanding of feudal emperors. Greedy, stingy, cunning, seemingly affectionate, but can be cold-blooded and ruthless when necessary. Emperors are ruthless. They say that there is no family affection in the Tian family. It is normal for fathers, sons, and brothers to chop each other off, but as an emperor, so stingy that he was asked to deliver a newspaper to major government offices in Beijing every day without mentioning remuneration, which was a bit stingy. What he did was not even considered plundering, it was simply naked plunder. Tang Ning was much more generous than Chen Huang. She reprimanded in her heart for a while and then stopped caring about the few pennies. He has been too busy during this period, and now he finally has some free time. The new year is coming soon. He plans to put down his work first and take time to spend time with Xiao Ru Xiaoi. We had agreed to go out for a walk with them today, but as soon as we walked out of the house, our father-in-law and mother-in-law suddenly came to visit us, so we had to turn back. Su Ru's Hongai I was chatting with Chen Yuxian in the room. Zhou Mingli walked up to Tang Ning, took something out of his sleeve, handed it to Tang Ning, and said, "Did you instruct the newspaper printed by Tang Renzai?" Tang Ning nodded. In an era when entertainment was extremely scarce, news was transmitted very slowly, first by mouth, and second by government notices. After the outbreak of new media in later generations, newspapers have been almost abandoned, but here, it is still something very advanced. Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "I have also read the newspapers in the past few days. There is nothing else. However, when it comes to discussions about state affairs and court officials, it is best not to write more about it to avoid blaming the court." Tang Ning knew very well that although newspapers were still a new product in this era, they were closely related to public opinion. If they wrote too much, the court would not sit idly by. Therefore, he is extremely strict in censoring the content published every day and strives to be politically correct and not touch red lines. There is also a lot of knowledge in how to grasp the scale. Otherwise, if the imperial court takes off the hat of talking about state affairs and imperial officials, the Jingxi Daily, which has just developed, will be nipped in the bud. Tang Ning looked at Zhou Mingli and said, "Father-in-law, don't worry. Your Majesty has already issued an oral order, asking Tang Renzai to deliver a newspaper to all major government agencies every day. I will take good care of the scale." "It's good that you have an idea," even His Majesty agreed. Zhou Mingli was relieved after hearing this and said, "You go ahead, I'll go and play 2 games of chess with old Tang." Tang Renzai. Early in the morning, the stall owner of the breakfast stall had just set up his stall and walked to the door of Tang Renzai. He threw a copper coin over and said, "Brother, here's a newspaper." The newspapers in Tang Renzai are very cheap. You can buy them with 1 copper coin. 1 copper coin can only buy half a meat bun and half a pot of tea. You can use it to buy a newspaper, read current events, and learn about the private lives of noble people. Many people do. The waiter took the money and handed over a newspaper. The stall owner handed it to a diner in the stall and said, "I can't read, please read it for me." "You won't be charged for this bowl of noodles." The shabby scholar at the stall took the newspaper and was happy to make the deal. He ate and read the newspaper. After reading it, he said, The newspaper said that the New Year's Day is approaching. This year, starting from the 28th of the 12th lunar month, the curfew will be lifted in the capital. It is a few days earlier than in previous years. The New Year's Day should be more lively. I was able to sell a few more bowls of noodles that year, and the business at the night market was very good. The vendor muttered, and then asked, "What else is there?" There are also anecdotes about several adults in the court. It says that Mr. Li, the minister of the Ministry of Industry, used to be in the Ministry of Water. When he was ordered to provide disaster relief, he always rushed to the front. He was washed away by floods twice and almost died. It is said that the people of Runzhou erected a statue of Master Li on the embankment to express their gratitude. The hawker said, "Master Li is really a model for all officials. If there are officials like Master Li in the court, the people will have a good life." What else is written on it? The son of Lu Feng, the Minister of Rights, got into a fight a few days ago and was taken to the county government office. The Ping'an County Government Office reminded the powerful people in the capital that as the new year is approaching, they must restrain their children. The breakfast vendor shook his head and said, "One is Master Li and the other is Master Lu. You said these are both officials. Why is there such a big gap between officials?" The shabby Confucian scholar put away the newspaper and asked, "Can you give this newspaper to me?" The vendor waved his hand and said, "Take it." The shabby Confucian scholar thanked him with his hands, stood up and left, walking along the street. Soon he came to an official office and walked in. He walked to a certain government office, knocked on the door and went in, saying, "Master Zhong Cheng, I have read the newspaper of Tang Grenzai, and it is quite satisfactory. It does not make excessive remarks about state affairs, but it does make some comments about officials in the DPRK and China." Censor Zhong Cheng stood up, waved his hand and said, "There is no need to check. His Majesty has just decreed that all major government offices in Beijing must read Tang Grenzai's newspaper. You can make arrangements and have someone pick up a few copies every day." The censor was startled when he heard this, then nodded and said, "I'll go and make arrangements now." Censor Zhong Cheng read the newspaper again and murmured, "Lu Feng, Li Yan. The people have their own opinions on what the powerful officials in the capital are like, some praising them and some criticizing them, but they are limited to the secret. The newspaper of Tang Grenzai is not shy at all. It talks about these things casually, but it is very accurate in its standards, only stating the facts and not making any comments. There is no doubt that if a name appears on it, whether it is a good thing or a bad thing, it will be known to the whole capital in a very short time. Whether His Majesty's decree also has the intention of urging all officials remains to be guessed." Ministry of Personnel. Fang Hong put a piece of paper on the table, looked at an old man and said, "Lord Zhou, this is the list reported by various departments, a total of 10 people. If there is no problem, it should be sent to His Majesty tomorrow. Although the Ministry of Personnel is responsible for the promotion and assessment of officials, senior officials such as the minister of a ministry only have the right to nominate but not the right to decide, and the final candidate still needs to be determined by the emperor." Minister Zhou picked up the paper and looked at it, saying, "It seems that the position of right assistant minister this time is between Lu Feng and Li Yan." As if he had thought of something, he shook his head and said, "Although Li Yan's political achievements in recent years are mediocre, he has no stains. The family style of Lu Assistant Minister of Rights is a bit bad. The family style is not strict and the children are dandy. This is a problem that many families in Beijing have, but it is rare to be used as a typical example like Lu Feng, the Assistant Minister of Rights. Moreover, His Majesty has issued an order that the newspaper of Tang Grenzai is a must-read for officials in Beijing. I am afraid that everyone knows that Lu Assistant Minister's family style is not strict." He picked up a memorial and copied the names of 10 people. When he wrote, he thought about it and wrote the name of Li Yan, the Assistant Minister of Works, as the first one. Lu family. Lu Feng looked at the newspaper in his hand with an unpleasant expression. At the critical moment when he and Li Yan, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Works, were competing for the position of the right assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, the newspaper praised Li Yan as a model official, but wrote about Lu Li being arrested for fighting. This clearly had a purpose. In comparison, doesn't it mean that he is not as good as Li Yan of the Ministry of Works? He had planned everything, but still missed this rebellious son. He angrily slapped his son and said angrily, "I told you to be honest a long time ago. Who told you to fight?" Lu Li covered his head, looking aggrieved, and said, "This is none of my business. It was Ling Feng and the others who started it first, and I was beaten." Lu Feng shouted, "If you don't provoke them, will they provoke you?" "I really didn't provoke them." Lu Li defended, "They wanted to make trouble for Tang Zhao. Tang Zhao ran away, so they took their anger out on me." Lu Feng frowned and said, "What does it have to do with you if they make trouble for Tang Zhao?" Lu Li looked at him resentfully and asked, "Why did they come to me?" "Dad, don't you really know?" Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 351. Fengzhou is the northernmost prefecture of Chen State. After leaving Fengzhou, you can enter Chu State in 2 days. The group set out from the capital on March 3 and arrived in Fengzhou on April 20. Although Fengzhou is located on the border, it borders Chu State. Chen and Chu have been friendly countries for many years, and the relationship has become closer in the past 2 years. Therefore, Fengzhou has never been heavily guarded. The court has arranged the main border forces in the prefectures bordering the grassland. Looking at the Fengzhou city wall from a distance, a feeling of desolation comes to the face. The rich land of Chen State is in the south of the Yangtze River. The prefectures further north are poorer. Officials in places like Fengzhou are either assigned to dilapidated places because of poor performance in the imperial examinations, or they are criminals with some stains on their bodies, but they are not to the extent of being dismissed and investigated, so they are allowed to waste their retirement in such places. Lu Teng rode up on his horse and said, "Lord Tang, we have arrived at Fengzhou." The expression on his face was much more serious than before. Once they left Fengzhou, they would be far away from the state of Chen and would no longer receive assistance from the government. The second half of this journey would be the most difficult time. Hirui walked up, kept a distance of 5 steps from Tangning, and said, "Lord Tang, let's go into the city." Since the people arranged by Prince Duan in the delegation had frequently encountered problems, Hirui did not dare to get too close to him. Tangning rode on his horse, looked ahead, waved his hand, and said, "Go into the city." The local officials of Fengzhou had already received the news that Princess Pinjiang's wedding procession was about to arrive in Fengzhou, and opened the city gate early. The local officials lined up in 2 rows and stood at the city gate to welcome them. When the wedding procession reached the city gate, the governor of Fengzhou led the officials of Fengzhou to step forward and bowed, saying, "Governor Dong Qunyi of Fengzhou and the officials of Fengzhou respectfully welcome Princess Pingyang. The envoy has worked hard all the way." Tang Ning rode on his horse, looked at the governor of Fengzhou below, and smiled, "Lord Dong, long time no see." He was very familiar with this governor of Fengzhou. 2 years ago, when he was still the governor of Lingzhou and the immediate superior of his father-in-law, the Zhong family suffered a lot at his hands. Later, because of the assassination of Li Tianlan, the officials of Lingzhou were collectively punished and exiled to Fengzhou. In fact, his fall from a promising governor of Shangzhou to today's situation is inseparable from Tangning. But think about it, if he hadn't forced Xiaoai to marry his son, there would be no throwing of the embroidery ball to recruit a husband. If Tang Yaoyao hadn't thrown the embroidery ball down, Tang Ning would have starved to death on the street. He actually didn't suffer any loss at the hands of Governor Dong, and he didn't have any deep hatred with him. When they met again after 2 years, he just felt that things had changed. The voice beside him sounded a little strange, but it seemed like he had heard it somewhere before. Dong Qunyi thought it was a colleague from his early years. He looked up and saw a young man looking down at him from a high position on the horse at the front of the delegation. This, sir. Judging from the age of the man on the horse, it was naturally impossible for him to be his colleague. Dong Qunyi couldn't remember where he had seen him for a while. Just as he opened his mouth, a light suddenly flashed in his mind, and he was shocked and said, "It's you." As a former governor of Lingzhou, he was still impressed by the genius Jiwen, who had not been seen in Lingzhou for decades, not to mention that he had some unclear grievances with this person and the Zhou family. Since the Chu envoy was assassinated in Lingzhou and he was transferred to Fengzhou, he had never heard of Tang Ning again. Unexpectedly, after only 2 years, when they met again, the other party had become envoy to send off the bride. Judging from his position in the team, his status must be not low. Dong Qunyi felt bitter and uneasy. He opened his mouth and didn't know what to say. Tang Ning said, "The princess is a little tired after traveling all the way. Let's go into the city first." Dong Qunyi nodded immediately and said, "The post house is ready. Please enter the city." Although the gate of Fengzhou city was dilapidated, the post house was very clean. There were not many houses in the small post house. In order to ensure quietness, only the princess and several envoys stayed there. The others were arranged in the nearby inns. After the group entered the post house, Lu Teng arranged for the guards to surround the post house inside and outside. Every 12 hours, 800 people were divided into 4 groups, each with 200 people, and they took turns to guard and patrol. Before Tang Ning entered Zhao Man's courtyard, Lu Teng stopped him and said, "Sir Tang, once we leave Fengzhou, the road may not be peaceful. I want to rest in Fengzhou for a few days, send someone to explore the road ahead, and then discuss the route." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Then listen to Commander Lu." Although Lu Teng is inflexible, stubbornness has its advantages. At least he is particularly concerned about the safety of this trip. This is his professional field. Tang Ning will not intervene unless there is something obviously wrong. Tang Ning walked into Zhao Man's room. She was sitting at the head of the bed, humming a cheerful little song, without any sadness about leaving her homeland. Seeing Tang Ning coming in, she immediately stood up and said, "I heard that the night market in Fengzhou city is very lively. Let's go out to see it at night." Fengzhou is neither a political center nor a military stronghold. There is no curfew policy. As long as you are not idle and wandering on the street at midnight, the guards patrolling the city will not pay attention to you. Along the way, Tang Ning agreed to all her requests as long as they were not excessive. He nodded and said, "We'll go out in the evening." Zhao Man sat in front of the mirror obediently and said, "Then help me dress up." "I like you to help me dress up." Fengzhou is located in the north. In mid-April, it gets dark at night. Lu Teng set up a tent outside the princess's courtyard and personally guarded it. When he saw Tang Ning and a palace maid coming out of the princess's courtyard, his eyes stayed for a moment and then quickly looked away. As long as it's not with the princess, he can be with whomever he wants. However, Mr. Tang already has 2 beautiful wives in his family, and he has an affair with the most beautiful woman in the capital. In addition, there are Tang Shui and that violent woman who went on a mission to the Chu state and still managed to get along with her. The princesses made flirts with each other, it's really enviable. He looked at the darkening sky, walked out of the tent, and said, "Add a few more torches." The night market in Fengzhou city is unexpectedly lively. In terms of nightlife alone, it is even richer than the capital city. Not to mention the various trinkets sold on the streets, all the major Gulanwei markets are brightly lit, and the shops on the streets are full of people. The night markets without curfew are even busier than the streets during the day. This slightly changed Tang Ning's initial impression of Fengzhou. It may be a little rundown, but it shouldn't be poor. The sky is high and the emperor is far away. If you don't have any ambitions to become a general or prime minister, being an idle governor here would actually be a problem. Not bad either. Zhao Man felt that she ate and slept along the way, and by the time Chu Kuokyo gained weight, she didn't eat anything at night. She just wandered around with Tang Ning. As long as she wasn't staying in the inn, she was just wandering around outside. Very happy too. Zhao Man walked beside him, jumping up and down with her hands behind her back, turning her head to look at him, and asked, "How are we going to come back from Chu?" Before arriving in Chu State, things were not yet clear, and the final measures taken were also different. If something happens to the Prince of Chu, such as choking on food, choking on water, being hit by a meteorite when going out, or being assassinated, then the marriage will naturally be annulled, and they can come back as they left. If none of these things happen, you will have to come back secretly, and subsequent events will be even more troublesome. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "If you can't see outsiders, including your father, after you come back from Chu, would you be willing?" Zhao Man looked up at him and asked, "Can I see you?" Tang Ning nodded. Zhao Man said nonchalantly, "I do." As soon as she finished speaking, the crowd in front suddenly surged. Tang Ning protected Zhao Man and took a few steps back. She heard a sound of breaking wind coming from the front, followed by a man's furious roar. Where did this barbarian come from? He dared to hit me. Although the light was dim, Tang Ning still saw the prairie woman standing on the street, holding a small red whip. Unexpectedly, she also came to Fengzhou, and it seemed that she had gotten into some trouble again. "Take this barbarian." The young man standing on the street covered his face and opened his mouth to say something. The expression on his face suddenly froze. He looked at a person standing in the crowd and blurted out, "Tang Ning." Tang Ning led Zhao Man out of the crowd, looked at the young man, thought for a moment, and asked, "Are you, Dongming Jun?" The young man finally came back to his senses, and the smile on his face gradually turned playful, and said, "What a coincidence, I didn't expect to see you here again."